All right. I'm here today with Bryan Caplan. Bryan is a professor of economics at George Mason University, a prolific blogger, and the author of several books. And actually, Bryan, when I was in high school, I can remember my dad gifted me the Myth of the Rational Voter,
Oh,
one of your very early ones.
all right. You're a middle
Uh,
school guy.
I mean, this had a huge influence on like my whole worldview, and it actually like sort of sparked my interest in sort of at what that time was like the early econ blogosphere, and just got me like into reading the internet more generally. So thrilled to have you on the show today. More recently, and where we'll probably try to focus the conversation, Bryan has been compiling previously published essays, in most cases, organizing them by topic, and then publishing them in book form. So far, these include Labor Econ versus the World, How Evil Are Politicians, Don't Be a Feminist, and Voters as Mad Scientists. And these I actually can't recommend enough. Bryan, I don't know if you know, there's a Reddit post called a Bryan Caplan primer. And I can remember a few years
Oh,
ago, I like dove into it, and it breaks all of your like ideas and posts into like sort of categories. And I was like, oh, this is like an easier way to read all of his stuff. And now you've just done it yourself, which is like even better. So these books though they're about 250 pages each. They're super easy to read, a little bit addictive. So really recommend that everyone go check them out. So excited to have you here today, Bryan. Welcome.
very good.
Cool. Before we get into actual content of your most recent essays, I wanted to ask you just about sort of nonfiction as a medium in general. One thing I didn't just mention in the intro is you also have a nonfiction graphic novel that you've published, and I believe you have one more in the pipeline. So you're sort of an innovator in the like nonfiction space right now. Since the internet, we got like the Kindle, but nonfiction books haven't really changed. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I would say they probably have changed in a lot of ways. I mean, the most obvious one is that nonfiction has gotten a lot bigger. So fiction used to crush nonfiction in sales, and I think that's no longer true. In terms of like what's going on with the Kindle, I'll admit I'm pretty out to lunch on that stuff. The main thing that I've remember is that for a long time, Kindle didn't have color, which messed it up for graphic novels. I think now it does have color. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe a different way to say this question is why aren't more people experimenting with nonfiction and other mediums, things like graphic novels and such? And maybe specifically econ people.
Wow. All right. So why are econ people being more experimental? I mean, honestly, most academic economists have so little interest in communicating any broader audience just to get them to do something besides writing journal articles is like pulling teeth. Most economists will like who do publish will never write a single book, even a book of a narrow academic focus. As to why that is, most of it, at least on the surface, is that academic incentives really only reward journal publications. You don't really advance your career by going and even doing an academic book very much. But I think the real story is just low ambition, people that are very turned in on their own very narrow world, right? And so they just don't care. Whereas to me, like if you're going to write anything, then obviously it's worth going and selling it to other people. It's not a diary. So why is that all you're doing? So yeah, I mean, I did start off early on by just trying to go and get tenure and publish journal articles. Even there, I was always trying to work on topics that could be of broader interest with the broader or longer run aim of going and doing a book that would at least reach out to a bigger audience. With my Open Borders and my other graphic novel in progress, Build Baby Build, there what it comes down to is there's just so much great research out there that is so boring and so poorly curated. I was just thinking, what can I do to get anyone to even care about this stuff? I then stumbled on a lot of nonfiction graphic novels. I'm hardly the first person to do one of those. For example, there's the Cartoon History of the Universe in 5 volumes. That's fantastic. I became a fan of those. And then the question is, well, could I do this? Well, I can't draw, so I can't do it by myself, but could I do something like that as part of a collaboration? I just started doing storyboards. I got some comics editing software. And then I managed to get one of the greatest artists that's working in the space right now, Zach Wienersmith. I didn't even know him at the first start, but I talked him into it. So that's really the story of that. And that is my one New York Times bestseller is Open Borders. So we were able to turn that graphic novel into a bestseller. Well, my thinking was, I want to get people to be more interested in reading it. Check. I want them to read it for a longer time period rather than just opening up and saying I'm bored. So check. And then the last step is I want to communicate more information per minute of readers' time. which I really do think you could do with this graphic novel format. So that's the other thing that's going on. So all these motivated me, plus just the fun of getting to do a different kind of project. I will say writing graphic novels is just more fun than doing normal writing, at least for me.
So let's get a little bit into the content of your most recent book of essays, Voters as Mad Scientists. So a recurring theme, and I actually really like this one, is the social desirability bias. Seems to be maybe one of your favorites as well.
Yes, that's part of the new other book that I'm working on right now, actually.
Oh, interesting. Okay, great, great. So for folks that don't know, I guess you can expand on this if I get it wrong, but it's basically the idea that people give answers to questions that they think will make them look good. Or another way of putting it is that, when the truth sounds bad, people just end up lying.
Exactly right.
And so you can sort of use this, and I think the core insight you had is that this is like why people vote for bad policies. They sort of treat like going to the polls like they're just taking a survey, and so they tend to say like what sounds good. So my question for you is, are there any societal benefits to the social desirability bias? And just like one example would be like, maybe deep down selfishly, people like, they want to drink and drive or something. But like, it's so shamed on, they say, oh gosh, like I shouldn't check the box for like drinking and driving should be legal. And so that causes them to vote for policies that like generally are agreed upon to be good ideas. So what's your thought there?
Not everything that sounds good is bad. We've got 4 boxes. There's the good, there's the stuff that sounds good and is good. There's the stuff that sounds good and is bad. There's the stuff that sounds bad but is good. And there's stuff that sounds bad and is bad. I mostly focus on that box of stuff that sounds good but is bad. That's where social desirability bias is really interesting as an explanatory concept. When the world works, there isn't really that big of a need to explain it. It's like, why don't countries destroy all their food? It's like, oh yeah, that really rarely happens. Well, under communism, there were a few cases, but still very unusual. And the answer is, yeah, well, it sounds really bad to say, let's destroy all food. It is really bad to destroy all your food. So it doesn't really happen. And there's not much to discuss. What's interesting to me is all the things that don't work well. And that's where I say a very strong sign of an existing policy that is bad is that it will at least sound good. It's really unusual that policies that sound bad and also are bad, because that stuff just doesn't happen very often. It's once in a long while, but it's really rare. And I would also just say in daily life, the nice thing about social desirability bias, it does remove a lot of the ugly coarseness of life. So to hire a preschool teacher with no social desirability bias talking to kids, I'd be feeling kind of sorry for those kids if you had the teacher who wasn't there saying, okay, and now let's all go and do something nice together. Let's all paint some pictures. And then you might say, well, is that literally a lie? Yeah, I'd say teachers, young kids, a lot of what they say is actually just factually untrue. Do you want kids to be exposed to something else? So my very first choice would be to have a really nice person who tells it like it is, even for the youngest kids. But I can see someone saying, we don't need that.
So let's maybe push the intuition on this like a little bit further. So say that we could genetically engineer people, and we're saying like, okay, we found this social desirability bias gene, and like we should just get rid of it in everyone. Like,
yeah,
should we get rid of it in everyone, or is it potentially that there's like a reason and some sort of benefit to having it here?
You basically have just described the plot of the movie The Invention of Lying with Ricky Gervais.
I actually haven't heard of it. Okay, good.
It's quite good. The movie's really good. Let's see. What would I say about it? I think ultimately it would just be better because the harm of these pretty lies is just so great. And then furthermore, I think that if we lived in a world where people didn't do it, we just get used to it. It wouldn't hurt our feelings nearly as much anymore. Right? Or like the main thing in the movie that is unrealistic is not that they don't lie. They also blurt out ugly truths instead of just keeping their mouth shut, which I'm a big believer just generally in honesty. And when people say, oh, it'll just be too hard to live that way, I say, look, you don't have to go and say everything you're thinking. Nobody does. Why would you? So rather than say a pretty lie, why not just change the subject?
So it's sort of the line of thinking that I'm used to. I'm sure you're familiar with is like the Chesterton's fence idea, right? It's like, well, there's like something here. Like maybe we should be very careful and investigate it before we get rid of it. Are you generally a fan of just like that concept, or like what do you think of it?
Yeah, no, I think that Chesterton's fence is basically just an excuse for continuing doing obviously bad things because without any argument. I think if you just go and apply it back in time, you'll see, wow, there's just a lot of stuff that people thought was sacred and then it turned out to be terrible. So no. And then like, I mean, I think the other thing is that, when people say, well, it's Chesterton's fence that like protected us from things like communist revolution. So like, we don't need any stupid fence to protect us from that. Just say the obvious thing. Like first of all, you're going to go murder millions of people for what? And then it's like, when you talk about your great socialist revolution, right? Well, after your revolution, who's going to take out the garbage? What's your plan for that? Like, why are people going to keep working if you just go and give equal amounts to everybody? I don't think that the really bad stuff is hard to argue against. I think it's really easy to argue against it. Really, the only defense that the worst ideas of this kind have is that it just sounds really good to say, oh, well, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. But I think that's super easy to argue against that. It's like, what do you think's going to happen in a world like that?
And okay, here's one more on social desirability bias. Whatever like the quote like culture war is, right? In like recent years, people have felt that politics has gotten much more heated. Like, do you think that maybe what this is people just like starting to realize social desirability bias and saying like, wait a second, if all that matters is convincing people what sounds good, then we should focus all of our energy actually just on the culture war and convincing people what is morally right and morally wrong to win votes. Is that a possibility?
Hmm, maybe. I mean, I'd just say the last few years are weird in a lot of ways. I mean, I'd say that a lot of what's going on with the culture war is that almost for the first time in history, the left has picked a bunch of things that just sound really bad. And then they are good at repackaging them. But it's just really hard to go and going and doing elective amputations on kids into something that sounds good. You can call it gender affirming care all you want, but it's like, come on. Like you're talking about going and amputating healthy body parts on kids. Why? Like they can't wait. Like this is so important. And I think that a lot of what's been going on the right is that they have smelled some blood in the water and say, wow, this time they've really actually stepped in it and they're pushing things where if I just describe it in any normal way, people are going to hate them for it. So I think that's one of the things that has gone on in recent years. I mean, in terms of other parts of policy. So like there is the culture war, but I also say that there's been a move to stronger anti-market policies on the left, which again, you might say is a intensification of social desirability bias, but not so sure that's what's going on. I think well, a lot of it is that they're not being very honest about what they're doing. So they have moved in a more anti-market direction, but that isn't what they're focusing on rhetorically. It's more like the other stuff is a smokescreen for what they really want to do, which is have much bigger government, much stricter regulation. And again, similarly, I would say with things like DEI, on the one hand, they are trying to use social desirability bias, like doesn't diversity sound good? Doesn't equity sound good? Doesn't inclusion sound good? But the level of brainwashing and and use of fear in order to get people to go along with stuff that's ultimately what neutrally describes is pretty terrible. I think this is why, like, the right with talking about CRT, they've been able to go and just come up with some ways of describing it that raise people's awareness of just how ugly it really is. I mean, I would just say generally, like whenever you're living in a particular series of political events, it's hard. That's when it is hardest to analyze. When you look back and have some perspective, test of time, that's when I would be more confident in describing what's going on.
Yeah, I guess my observation was just sort of that the rhetoric seems to be like very pointed at the social desirability bias,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that like all of the issues that you just mentioned are sort of fought over like what is good and like what you should vote for, right? And what is wrong. And so there's sort of like these big overarching moral issues versus in the past, you would see much more often, should we make the top tax bracket 60% or 45%? Quite a bit different now.
You're a bit young, I'll say. It's not like
yeah.
it was ever radically different. Cultural issues were always important. I can't remember any time when they weren't. To me, what is unusual about the current day is that primarily on the left, the gap between the sheer ugliness of some of their pet issues and the energy put into making it sound good is just really high because again, the rioting, the George Floyd riots, very ugly intrinsically. So it really is sort of stretching the limits of human rhetoric to put a good spin on it, but they haven't tried.
Okay, so one idea you have that I really like, and this is I feel like a super Bryan Caplan idea, is you have a really simplistic theory of left versus right. Do you mind expanding on that and how you came up with
Yes.
it?
Right. To be clear, I call it the simplistic theory of left and right. So, no, simplistic is obviously a negative term. I wanted to own that negative term just to not oversell what I'm offering. But my simplistic theory of left and right is this: the left is anti-market, the right is anti-left. A lot of people said, "Well, no, what are you talking about? No, the right is pro-market or something like that." And it's like, no, that's not really true. What unites almost all leftists is complaining about markets. But there are plenty of right-wingers who don't like markets either. What unites right-wingers is not liking the left. The way that I like to explain this is, imagine that we go and we've got a time machine and we're able to go all the way around the world and just collect all the self-identified leftists since the French Revolution, all the self-identified rightists since the French Revolution, which is around the time these words start being used. And then put all the leftists in a room and say, all right, you guys have to write a position statement, and it's got to get at least 80% of you on board. And we say the same thing to all of the historic international right-wingers. What I say is that at first you might think you're not going to be able to get Joe Biden, Joseph Stalin, and Robespierre to all agree to some stuff. But I think you, in fact, will. And what they're going to agree on is a bunch of complaints about markets. Similarly, you might say you're not going to be able to get Bryan and Mussolini and Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower to agree to anything. And I'll say, no, actually you will. You're going to get us to agree to a bunch of complaints about the left. All right. So it's a minimalist theory, deliberately so. It's not, I want to leave open the fact that these movements change enormously over time. I'm actually in the middle of reading a book called The Myth of Left and Right, which takes an even stronger position than mine and just says the idea of left and right, they're just total illusions. They mean nothing. And I say, look, they mean a lot less than most people think, but they do mean something. It's just very unusual to find a leftist go and say nice stuff about markets, unless they immediately say something bad about markets, right? And similarly, very hard to find any person who self-identifies as right-wing who will just say good stuff about the left without then taking it back. The way I like to think about it is this. Just imagine going to anyone who identifies as left-wing and just say, all right, here's your task. Say something good about markets and then shut up. Right? And just, because they want to say, all right, fine. Markets have been very good at producing a lot of stuff, but the distribution, no, you can't. You've just lost the challenge. You just had to say something good and then be quiet. And then similarly, imagine going to right-wingers and saying, say something good about the left and then shut up. It's like, okay, well, they did go and give us Social Security, but no, can't do that. Like, that is the psychological barrier that is very hard for people to overcome because they do have this tribe in their hearts.
I like the simplicity portion of it, so I'm not going to poke too hard to get holes because I think it's pretty all encapsulating. But like, one question related is how does an idea become left or right? Like, would you have known a priori like which party would be for or against COVID vaccines or Ukraine war or some of these more modern issues where I'm not sure that I could have guessed 5 years ago, like which side would care about which issue?
A lot of issues, really, it's totally arbitrary and it's just a matter of alliances and conformity. And this is what this book that like I said, I'm reading right now, Myth of Left and Right, is very good on. Sure, it's totally unclear why abortion is a left-wing cause. It could just as easily be the other way around. Right? You have to then understand, well, here's the thing is that you've got the feminist movement and they're left wing because they got a bunch of complaints about markets. That's where they feel at home. And then because once they're there, then they're going to be pro-choice. And then other people that are in the same alliance with them need to get on board with that in order to keep the alliance together, something like that. All right. However, I would say that there are a lot of issues where if you think about it, it's a lot easier to understand why they came down the way they did. Like there is this view that conservatism is about some kind of disease disgust. I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but there are people there saying, that's the idea. So conservatism, the root thing is being grossed out by impurities. I know it's like, that seems a little suspicious. But anyway, if you had this view, you might think that it would be conservatives that would be the real hardliners on COVID lockdowns, when of course it wasn't that way. I'll say that since I do spend a lot of time reading the far left, I really read The Nation magazine quite faithfully. I think once you understand their mindsets, then you do understand why lockdowns were a left-wing thing, which is they have no appreciation of the consumer economy. They really just don't care about it. Combined with, they have a lot of resentment of the very idea of work. They really will use the phrase wage slave non-ironically. So once you get someone that doesn't really care about consumer culture very much, and like the fact that people are spending money and enjoying life and they just don't put much value on that, combined with they just think that there's something cruel and oppressive about having a job, then you can understand why a person like that is going to be pro-lockdown. And now I don't say The Nation speaks for all the left, but I think that these attitudes in a milder form are there. So I think that it's not that hard to understand why the left was much more in favor of the general war on COVID. Once you have that, then as to why vaccines also became a left-wing thing, I think you just have to just make this last step of, well, once you are really hard on every possible way of fighting COVID, the other side says, well, we're against that stuff. And then, vaccines sound like another thing you're really trying to go and crush us with. So we're going to be against that too. I mean, logically, obviously, you could say, well, once we have vaccines, then the pandemic ends and we'd like to get back to normal. So it's the people that like normal life that should be pro-vaccine. Logically, that makes perfect sense. But psychologically, I still think it's not so hard to understand why vaccines wind up going with the rest of the strong, the strict anti-COVID policy package. And as to why that one was basically an anti-market package, I think it makes sense, because it's like, well, what's the big deal of shutting down our consumer economy? And isn't it actually kind of nice that people don't have to go to work anymore?
All right. A little bit related. This one really actually kind of blew my mind, and I've been thinking about it a lot, is this idea of the respect motive.
Yeah.
So maybe you're a socially conservative immigrant, right?
Mhm.
And in the previous country that you came from, like most of your values might align with a conservative party or conservative ideals in the US, but you might vote the other way because who knows? But your idea is because the left may respect them more. And you actually give a bunch of examples of this, and it seems to be pretty bulletproof. So my question to you is like, why hasn't anyone gamed this? Like, why doesn't both of the parties just start respecting everyone more?
Yeah. So just to back up, the idea of the respect motive is that people will support whichever party respects them more. That's
Yes.
all right. I mean, obviously, this not meant to be 100% predictive. There's going to be exceptions, but nevertheless, that's the general story. And I do use this in a bunch of ways, like if you're just thinking about different occupations. So like lawyers are a high income group, but they're very left wing. And I think that makes sense because Democrats respect lawyers more, right? Or let's see, teachers, same way. On the other hand, the military, more Republican because Republicans respect them more. Now, why don't politicians game this? I say that they totally do. And for as long as I can remember, they always have. The idea of being a politician is really going to every possible group you can and saying, oh God, you guys are so wonderful. You veterans are so wonderful. You Albanians are so wonderful. You aircraft or also air traffic controllers are so wonderful. This is a standard thing that you do as a politician, is just go around kissing babies and telling people how great they are. Now, why isn't the game more? A big part of it is, as I said, the theory is that people vote for whichever party respects them more. There's a limit to how credibly you can convince people that you are the moral party in a lot of cases. You know, I'm pretty sure if there's Democrats listening and then I say, like, yeah, Republicans respect veterans more, there's going to be a lot of Democrats saying, we respect veterans a lot. Like, yeah, who respects them more? And if there just is a contest, it's going to be hard for Democrats to win this because the audience knows, well, but you've said some negative things about the military and you may say I'm anti-war, pro-troop, but that sounds a lot less respectful than someone who says that we were doing great heroic deeds and they also like us. So there's that. It's, basically it is a contest where both sides are trying to do it. And that means that if one side just has any rhetorical edge, they tend to win. So it's very common for Republicans to, for example, go and we're going to go and address the NAACP. right? And they try to go and say, look, like we share a lot of your values, and Lincoln was Republican, yeah, but still, like when the Democrat comes, they can just say, this person thinks that we're better than that person, so we're going to go and stay with this person. On the case of the socially conservative immigrant, that one is interesting because yes, immigrants have been notably very democratic for a long time, and yet, because of wokeness, it does seem like Hispanics are flipping. And it's like, gee, like I will say this is one that I was a bit puzzled by, but it's, again, and there's something called hindsight bias where once you know a fact, it's easier to explain it. But nevertheless, when you start off with, well, it seems like on the one hand, Republicans like Trump are really going out of their way to insult Hispanic immigrants. But on the other hand, so many of the wokeness things are so almost deliberately calculated just to offend Hispanics and just horrify them, and just to say like all the way down to Latinx. We're basically saying, yeah, we're going to go and spit on your whole language and try to go and make you conform to our norms. And we're not interested in even doing the minimum thing of speaking as you speak. You say Latino, Latina, we're going to say Latinx, just to go almost out of our way to antagonize you in the name. You say, well, Hispanics like that. Yeah. A few woke Hispanics like that who are totally out of step with the rest of the ethnicity. So I do think that once you start putting that list down, you can understand why Hispanics have been shifting so Republican and so rapidly, is they just feel alienated. He also, in terms of being at least anti-rioting, I think Hispanics really do not go for that. So you can see that Bukele of El Salvador is the most popular politician in the entire Spanish-speaking world now. He cracks down on crime, and Hispanics like that. That's more of what Hispanics are about. And so if you are against that, then you are at least not respecting them as much as the side that does go along with that. And of course, by the way, I can say all this without endorsing any particular view. Right? This is a descriptive theory. I know a lot of people get in my case because I'll say something and say, well, that doesn't sound very consistent with what you said. I said, well, because what I said is on a different topic.
Yeah. I mean,
in a package of views that that I can sell easily. Like I'm an actual thinker here. I'm trying to go and get to the bottom of a bunch of different issues. Often the truth winds up being this ugly hodgepodge of different positions on different issues because the facts just go different ways on different issues. I mean, if I were a politician, that'd be a problem for me, but thank God I'm not.
I mean, that's part of the like fun of reading your books is I myself really don't like politics. There's a post I always reference to people by, I think it's on Less Wrong by Eliezer a couple of years ago, called Politics is the Mind Killer.
Yeah.
And it's basically just like really short. And it's just like, when people think about the politics, they basically get stupid. And that's sort of, just generally like what I observe as well. But like what's interesting about a lot of your essays is while they're about politics, they're much more descriptive and just trying to like understand the nature of like what is left, what is right, why do people behave the way they do, why do people have certain views, and much less about making a case. So it is one of the more interesting things.
Yeah, I mean, I've got very strong normative views. However, I can forget about those when I'm just trying to understand what's going on. So if the goal is, well, why are these people voting this way? Normally people want to say, well, they're voting this way because these are good people, or they're voting this way because they're bad people. So, hell, they're all pretty flawed human beings, but here's what I think is actually driving the results.
There's one essay you have that's also really good called Material versus Rhetorical Dominance. And the basic idea is that material dominance you could think of as like the control of economics. So like wealth, power, businessmen, people in government. And then rhetorical dominance would be like sort of the control of like words and ideas. Like you got the media, schools, your HR departments, and that both sides, the left and the right, you could think of one as controlling material dominance and one as controlling rhetorical, but they both want the other one really badly. My question for you, and you could expand on it if there's actually more to say about the idea here, but my question is, could that actually in itself also be a description? Is it maybe tautological that one always has rhetorical dominance and one has material dominance? And like that is the core of how they exist, rather than like it's a happenstance that one happens to own one and the other the other.
Right. I don't think that it's happenstance. I mean, my description would be this. The left has rhetorical dominance almost basically all the time. and they got but yeah, and then material dominance of government, they got half the time. Um, the right, on the other hand, they've got rhetorical dominance in a few narrow spheres, like certain kinds of religion, so obviously right-wing television, radio, but they feel very deprived of that. They're doing quite a bit better on material dominance, although there, when you think, what I would say is that while there's this left versus right difference, the ones that I was thinking about more strongly actually were things like gender or race, where they say that men continue to go and have a lot more material dominance in terms of running major companies and being in the tops of science, and also like having a much larger share of politics. And yet, all women have much stronger rhetorical dominance. Almost no one wants to go and give a speech and say, men are great, men deserve their positions, men have earned them. So that's one we're like, oh, I don't want to go and talk that way. And instead, it's very easy to go and give a speech about how women are being mistreated. Women have actually done great stuff. I think it's about Bill Burr, a comedian, has this bit on how just one of the big stars of female basketball is giving a big lecture to a bunch of the elites of male basketball and saying like, and explain to me why it is that the best female basketball players played 1/10 the best male basketball players. Explain to me why it is that the amount of money that we get, the time slots for the televising of our shows are so much worse. And his joke is they're all there going like, gee, I don't know. I couldn't possibly. It's like, everybody knows why. It's because people don't like women's basketball very much. The reason why they're doing so well is because they got the viewers, they got the money. But what they don't have is the sense that people will support them if they talk about how they deserve every penny that they have. I will say that, there are around the world, the norm throughout history is actually that whoever's in charge has both material and rhetorical dominance. Think about like Saudi Arabia today. All right, the Saudi monarchy, they got the material dominance, they got the secret police, they got the army, they got the hacking off heads of anyone who goes and challenges them. At the same time, they've also got the rhetorical dominance of the mullahs and the Wahhabi mullahs going and saying this is the true religion, these are anointed by God. And then they are terrified of there being a few people saying, no, they are not ordained by God. We are ordained by God. And it's like, better kill those people real fast, because that cuts on, you will be under the sword instead of your enemies. So, yeah. I'd say overall, I think this idea of like the left is doing really well in rhetorical dominance. They do have these, like you said, they got the schools, they got the media, not all obviously, but overwhelmingly. And then in terms of material dominance, basically the right runs the government about half the time. In terms of even things like running corporations, I think they've had a really big fall. So I think they've been losing material dominance quite a bit. But still, if you run the government half the time, that's still pretty impressive.
So you have one essay that talks about how you argue more with the other side than people on your side who are too extreme, right? So, maybe someone says we should have like 70% markets, and you say we should have 100% markets, and like you spend all the time fighting with them. But someone who's like even more free market than you or whatever, maybe by 10x, you spend basically no time arguing with them. And my question here was for, do you want to restate it actually?
I guess so. Possibly I'm just misremembering.
Do you know which essay I'm going after? Yeah.
Mainly as it is like, I don't waste time going and talking to extremists who disagree with me because we just don't have any common ground. I am very happy to go and talk to moderates who disagree with me, because there I think we can actually make some progress. I do actually spend a fair amount of time talking to extremists who disagree with me, often just to say, here's an argument that our side likes, but this argument's actually incorrect. So I will do that too, definitely. So it's possible that I did say that what you're saying at some point, but I definitely don't remember it.
Yeah, sort of my interpretation was that you typically won't fight as much with someone who has a more extreme view. And maybe not you specifically, like Bryan Caplan. I mean, in general, not you, but like the bias would be right. Like, and think about it. Like, if you are very anti-market, you spend actually like not as much time like fighting against someone who's like totally like communist as you do fighting against someone that like is like a little bit pro-market, and like you're actually very close in your views. They're the other direction. So you spend less time thinking about them. That's the concept. Am I getting that right?
Yes. Okay. Now I know where you're coming from. Yeah. So, there is, of course, the stereotype of there being lots of infighting and the heretic is worse than the infidel. What I say is that that story is half true. It's very common for extremists to go and get really mad at the moderates on their own side. It's not very common for the moderates to get really mad at the extremists. So some of that is just in terms of the argument. The extremists will go and write things about how bad the moderates are. The moderates just don't spend nearly as much time arguing with the extremists. But more importantly, when the moderates do argue with the extremists, they're not so angry. So there's sort of this, there's an asymmetry where the extremists are angry at the moderates. The moderates are not really so angry at the extremists. Psychologically, I think this makes a lot of sense. It's very normal that a moderate is just an older extremist. You're an extremist when you're young, and then you become a moderate when you're old, and therefore you have a lot of sympathy for the young extremists. Oh, you're the way that I was when you were young. I understand and appreciate your idealism. Unfortunately, the real world is more complicated. That person isn't nearly as angry as the young person looking at the moderate sellouts on their side, saying, these traitors, they pretend to care, they don't really care. And I think what you're thinking about is I use this to go and explain things like, why is it so hard for the Palestinians to make peace with the Israelis? Right. And I think a lot of, even when you have your moderate Palestinian leadership who are not themselves really into waging a big terrorist war against Israel. But the problem is, to get peace with Israel, they would have to do more than just say, we're no longer going to go and have terrorist war with Israel. To get a deal, they basically have to go and hunt down their young extremists and massacre them. And it's like, we don't really want to do that. Yes, they did go and blow up a bus in Israel and they broke the peace. And that's really bad. And we're very, very upset about that. But on the other hand, they're idealists and we were once as they were. And so we're not that angry at them. We understand where they're coming from. And we're not going to go and crack down on them with all our strength. And that means that you're not going to get peace with Israel, because that's what the Israelis want, is for you to go and just completely wipe out your young idealistic radicals with no mercy. And I think you can see this in lots of other political areas. Like, why in general is it that terrorists, outright terrorists, while they are often criticized by people who share their basic values, still it's just hard to be that angry at them for most people. It's like, well, you have to understand that they were responding to something really bad. And while I disagree with their methods, but it's not like they're terrible people. So that kind of thing.
Yeah. My thought on it is, I was wondering if we could actually bring back in social desirability bias to explain some of this.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if you hold a view, your actual view could be extreme, but the social desirability bias brings you back to sort of state of preference that is slightly less extreme. And so the extremists are actually extreme extremists because they're pulled back down by the social desirability bias. And so if you have, on the one end, you're like, oh, well, those extremists actually hold kind of my views. I just tone it down a little bit in front of everybody else. And the question is, if this is true, would you say that the stated preferences that you have for open borders in your books, that you are even more extreme than you are typically writing about them?
I would say no. I try to just say it like it is, and just be candid with people. In terms of whether extremists or moderates are better exemplars of social desirability bias, it's actually complicated. So think about this. Something that sounds really good is by any means necessary, which is a standard extremist thing to say. But then it's to say, well, what about if we have to go and murder babies in order to get it? No, definitely not murdering babies. That's also social desirability bias. I said, well, wait a second. These are incompatible positions. By any means necessary includes murdering babies. And then it's like, well, I want to be able to do both things. I want to say by any means necessary and also don't murder babies. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because those are two logically incompatible positions. And that's actually where a lot of the gap between moderates and extremists is. Extremists will have some slogans that sound really good, but then they also bite a bunch of ugly bullets about the implications of those. Whereas moderates are more focused on, I don't want to bite any ugly bullets, which does make it harder for them to go and use the really beautiful slogans like by any means necessary. So, I think I would say it's not clear which side is more influenced by social desirability bias. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's just the truth.
One more essay on venerating great names. So you're very against this, right? And so the idea is, some people might take Keynes or Hayek or David Hume and sort of from the mountaintops, just talk about how great they are. And they almost become like too influenced by them in your view. It's like a very intellectually taxing thing. You're going to lose a lot of deep insight and first principles thinking if you're always like too attached to a single thinker. But I'm wondering, and my idea was maybe more like almost in like the sort of like Girardian sense of like, I don't just like Adam Smith's ideas. Like I want to be Adam Smith. And this is like a huge motivator that actually gets people like into economics in the first place. So like, is there actually maybe a cause for veneration? And is it not always bad if it's able to motivate people to get interested in a topic?
I mean, definitely I would not say it's always bad. The main issue is it's not clear to me that veneration does actually get people to especially be more productive in a field. There are some people get some inspiration, like Brahms with a bust of Beethoven on your piano. Say, oh God, he's so great. I just want to be like him. Although that's a nice case because actually a common view of Brahms' biographers is that he was held back because he just kept feeling like his music wasn't as good as Beethoven's. And so he wasn't publishing it. So maybe, so it could definitely go both ways. Out of the people that I know who really venerate famous thinkers of the past, I think that they just wind up spending a lot of their energy on the veneration and trying to make sure that their heroes get credit and not nearly enough on actually coming up with new arguments or testing old arguments. So, I mean, my view is, well, logically it's totally possible a person get inspired by a particular thinker, but I just don't see it as a net positive because people that are too focused on the greatness of a previous thinker usually just want to spend a lot of their careers talking about how great that person is. And I don't see that advances anything. And often it makes them dumber in that there's arguments they wouldn't even accept if not for the fact that their great thinker said it. And so they have to sit around saying, well, this great thinker said it, it must be true in some sense. Let me figure out how to square the circle and reconcile it. My friend Pete Betke has even openly said, my view is that all the people that I admire actually agree with each other in some way. And it's like, yeah, or maybe they don't. It becomes very Talmudic, where, Talmudic scholarship, a lot of what they do is, all right, we've got the Bible, we've got Maimonides, we got some other great rabbis. They are all great. They're all smart. They're all wise. They must ultimately all agree. How? And it's like, yeah. So then you just spend your life wasting your time trying to reconcile the unreconcilable. So it's sort of a silly thing to do.
Do you view this as different than like heroes? So you take like a Napoleon, he's like quite obsessed with the idea of Julius Caesar, or even Steve Jobs, like was really obsessed with the founder of Kodak, I think Edwin Land. Like it's pretty common for some of these like really, really highly successful people to like be really hero focused. Is that different than your idea of venerating some intellectual?
I mean, I guess I would just say that are they more hero focused than a normal person? If not, then it's not clear that being the hero focus was actually causally important. Or again, I think the honest answer is for some people, having a hero motivates them, especially if they don't really look too closely and they just sort of think of the hero as exemplifying industry and intelligence and creativity. If that's all the person is this person was just awesome, I want to be like this person, then maybe plausibly it's actually motivating. On the other hand, if the hero is someone who has a following 100 doctrines, and then you want to spend your life defending their doctrines, that's where I think it's very disruptive because it's just very unusual, at least, that someone gets everything right or even most everything right. A lot of this admittedly is just empirical, where I have had a bunch of heroes at one time in my life, and then I learn more. So, oh, well, actually they're wrong about a bunch of things. And if I had been really married to them as my heroes, then it would have been hard to realize that they had made these mistakes. And it's a good thing that I care about getting the right answers more than about defending the person. Right? When I meet people that care more about defending the person, it's like, wow, you're never going to get to the right answer because you're so married to loving Ayn Rand, or you're so married to loving Adam Smith or Karl Marx or whoever, that it's just hard for you to really look at reality directly, which is the way that we actually learn. You've got to stare at the real world, have that be your main focus.
So you make a lot of public bets. And that's been kind of your thing for a little while. You named your new Substack after making public bets as well. Bet on it. So I have a question. Do you play the stock market at all?
I play it in the sense of I am essentially 100% into stocks for my retirement, and I do a very high savings rate. I don't play it in the sense of going and actively trading. So I've always done index funds. My general view is that you want to just have a highly diversified bundle of stocks. I don't think that I have any special inside knowledge about what's going to do better or worse. I do think that it is good to have global diversification, not just national diversification. Even a lot of people that do diversify just only own stocks in their own country, which is a foolish thing to do. You don't know that your own country is going to be the most successful one. So why not go and spread your bets around so you can get a global average? Like the only times that I've ever even been tempted to go and play the markets in the sense of actually trading. So 2008, a couple weeks before the big crash, I did have the hairs on the back of my neck going up and saying, this is different, this is different, this is different. I should sell everything. And I talked to my friends at lunch and saying, I know I've been a buy and hold person for as long as you know me, but this seems different. And I really want to sell. What do you think? And they said, don't do it. And so I listened to them, didn't sell. And I then lost a pile of money when the market crashed. The market did, of course, more than fully recover, and I did keep buying during that time. So in the end, the crash was good for me, but I could have done a lot better if I had followed my instinct. Then in 2020, during the early phase of COVID, I got exactly the same instinct. And this time I said, last time I didn't listen, this time I'm going to listen. And I sold everything at the bottom. So wrong, Bryan. If you had just stuck with your usual strategy of buy and hold and had proper humility, then you would not have lost an enormous amount of money. I did go and buy back before the peak. So I think I bought back halfway between the recovery. So it wasn't the maximum disaster, but still it was a really bad outcome for me. And I wish that I had just stuck with my policy. And yeah, my current plan is I'm never going to deviate from buy and hold again.
I feel like those stories are way too common of mistiming a previous buy and hold strategy.
Yeah.
I guess actually the part I left out was like you're undefeated in your bets, right? You maybe have like one that's like due to potentially expire with a loss or something, but you're really good. So like that was a framing I was getting at is like, what's your edge in all of these bets? And like, why do you think you couldn't actually do really good in the stock market? It's odd to be like so successful.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the stock market, you have the most brilliant minds in the world that are working on this all the time. And there's arbitrage, right? So even if most people think one thing, if that's wrong, there's some other rich people who are going to bet on the other side and tend to mitigate that. So I basically bet on things where I think that first of all, I've got special knowledge. And second of all, there are a lot of very emotional people who get carried away by their own ideology, and they are my marks. So the people who say, there's going to be hyperinflation because they've got some particular monetary philosophy, those are the people like, you are not looking at the facts. You are married to these ideas. This is some kind of weird ideology religion for you, and I'm going to challenge you. Normally, of course, they just refuse to bet. But I do make almost all of my money off of people that did drink their own Kool-Aid. They had some big philosophy of what they think had to happen according to that philosophy. And I bet them and they were just wrong. Often it's just sheer hyperbole. Someone may even be in the right direction, but being in the right direction isn't exciting enough for them. And so they need to go and predict that the stars are going to fall. And they'll say, the stars won't fall. Maybe one star will fall, but they're not all going to fall. And so let's put some money on that.
What is the Bryan Caplan alternative to our current democracy? This is to sort of like wrap up the voters as mad scientists and political or rational rationality concept. Like, what is the proposed alternative?
Great question. All right, this is where I can give you the answer that sounds good, and then I'll give you the answer that's my actual view and maybe lose all credibility, but I'll do it.
Okay, let's get both.
Yeah. So, like what I say in the Myth of the Rational Voter is that what we call democracies actually coexist with a long list of anti-democratic limitations. So the First Amendment is undemocratic. The Supreme Court is undemocratic. So what I say in the Myth of the Rational Voter, which is mostly on economics, is that it would be good to have undemocratic restrictions of what democracy can do. At the very end of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, they put a new amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of production and trade. Right. So things like that, things that make it harder for government to do what it does. If you could have supermajorities for government to go and regulate the economy, supermajorities to spend money. So I think these would also, the Council of Economic Advisors could overrule government policy and say, well, this is uneconomic, so you can't do it. All right. These are things that I think would push in the right direction, be improvements. To a lot of people, this is radical enough. It's like, oh my God, this is so shocking. But my honest view is, don't just go and really tie the hands of governments. So if you could get a constitutional government where government basically had almost no range of what it could do, I think that would be great. But now to get to the part where I destroy my credibility,
Yes.
I am actually an anarcho-capitalist. This is someone who thinks that we should privatize everything, meaning everything, and the government just won't exist anymore. Not that the functions will no longer be performed, but they'll be performed by corporations, by businesses, instead of by what we think of as government. Just to start off, I'll say that I recognize this idea seems completely crazy. Uh, I need an hour even to go and convince people that maybe it's not completely crazy. I will defend this in public, but I always start with the caveat of, I'm going to give you an idea that will seem completely crazy to you. I don't think I can change your mind on it being wrong, but at the end, I want you to say it's still totally wrong, but it's not crazy. Uh, Now, in terms of how to explain this, often people say, are you an anarcho-capitalist? And I'll say, yes, but not the crazy kind. And what's the difference between the crazy kind and the non-crazy kind? The crazy kind thinks that you can get rid of the government today and things will be good. I don't think that. I think that anytime that you have any kind of dramatic change in your system, you expect total disaster, civil war is extremely likely, and that would be absolutely awful. So I'm not that kind. What I do think is that the following system, once established, would be stable. This is a system where instead of having government, you go and you get your own private defense company. And today, when you call the police, instead you call up your security company and they take care of you. When there's a dispute between these companies, you might say, well, they just fight it out. They could, but that's not what insurance companies do. Insurance companies could litigate every single case. They don't because they realize it's very expensive. It's much cheaper for them to go and work out an arbitration system. And again, arbitration already exists such that like you have a dispute with someone else, you go and you arbitrate rather than go to court, saving the costs. Then finally, last step is where do you get the rules? And I'll say, well, there's competing arbitration companies which make rules. Now, people are normally thinking, well, this is going to be absolute chaos, civil war. And I'll say, look, it would be if we adopted it overnight. But once it existed as something that people were used to, then I say the system would actually be totally functional. And when people are saying, well, it's so unrealistic, how can you even believe this? The best thing I can do is say this. All right, imagine we go back to 1000 AD in Scandinavia. We go and talk to a bunch of Vikings and we say, here's my proposal. We're going to have democracy. Instead of having its survival of the strongest and whoever kills his enemies gets to rule, we'll go and all cast votes and whoever gets the most votes wins. All right, if you said this in 1000 AD to those Vikings, they would no doubt have laughed in your face. Right? Ha, ha, ha. And they would have said, well, what difference does it make? So whoever wins the election, whoever's stronger just goes and murders him and takes over. So your election is totally pointless. And in 1000 AD, that would have been totally true. Now, fast forward to modern Sweden and imagine that someone in the cabinet of the current government just says, how about if we lose the election, we just go and murder our enemies and continue to rule? And in that case, people would laugh at you. They would laugh at you. Why? First of all, they know you're not going to convince anybody else in the government. They'll just think it's too ridiculous. But second of all, they know that even if the government did try it, it would just fail. Everyone would just say this is absurd and we're not going along with this. So there's a general tendency, you're right, not just a tendency, but a very strong fact, which is that ideas that sound crazy are just very hard to pull off. Right? So once something becomes normal, then it does tend to be enduring. And I say, now what's the point of this example? My point is, in a world where we have gotten used to the idea of defense services are handled by private security, where arbitration companies go and adjudicate disputes and are the ones that compete with each other by making rules, that negotiate with each other in order to get enough similarity of rules for them to coexist. In a world like this, when someone says, hey, why don't we go and just attack our enemies? It will be as ridiculous as someone in modern day Sweden saying, let's go and kill our enemies and not have democracy. So again, I realize this is a lot to take in a short amount of time. I don't even pretend that this will sound like something that's plausible unless I've got a lot of hours to talk to you about it. All I say is I think that I generally come off as a reasonable person. I thought this was crazy too when I first heard it. And now I don't think that it's crazy. Now I'll just say, I think the main issue is just how do we get from here to there? And I'll say, I don't know. I would have said the same thing in 1000 AD in Scandinavia. How can we get from rule by warlords to democracy? I don't know. I don't know. I know that it happened. I know that it happened. So it's just something to do with Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. And over time, we just put more value on human life and more value on being peaceful, more value on consent. That is my best route towards things improving. But yeah, I know that it's tough to go and do such a fundamental change. And basically just to get people to say, democracy itself is still a form of oppression. It's still just dictatorship of the majority. What about a system where we actually respected individual consent and where you actually needed a person to agree to go along with with whatever you're doing to them in order to go and be considered to be an ethically proper system? So that's what I got. I mean, I would say, so I didn't come up with this myself. So if you read Murray Rothbard's For New Liberty or David Friedman, but there's also my student Ed Stringham has a great edited volume called Anarchy in the Law. I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis on this called The Economics of Non-State Legal Systems. I guess the main thing that I say just to convince people that it's not so crazy is, look, people think that we need to have a monopoly over police. We don't have a monopoly over police already. We already have more security guards than police, so it can't be the case that allowing private police leads to civil war. That's crazy. No one's worried about mall cops going and attacking the government and seizing power. Similarly, it is not true that we have a monopoly of government courts. We have private arbitration. It's a huge industry, right? And furthermore, it isn't true that government makes all the rules. Credit card companies make their own internal rules. Arbitration companies make their own internal rules. Insurance companies do this. It is just not true that government has a monopoly right now. So we're not talking about doing something that has never been tried before. We're talking about taking the dials that are currently set somewhere around 5 on a 0 to 10 scale and turning them up. I would say that once you understand this, I don't think you can reasonably argue that we can't go up to 9. So for police to say more than half of the people that do the policeman's job are not actually government employees right now. So we can go all the way up to 9, and there's little doubt that we could get by with this. Maybe you might say it's worse, but it's not going to lead to chaos or breakdown of society or civil war. And then the last question is, can we go from 9 to 10? Can we go all the way there till you hear the click? We've hit the maximum. And that's where government doesn't exist. Again, this is not like some crazy idea of we get rid of police, right? It's rather a case of we still have police. It's just that they're run privately and you pay for their services.
It's the year 2100. What's your odds that any form of government resembling this exists?
Yeah, I'm still going to give it really low.
Yes.
One form of government on Earth has, like one society doesn't have government and it's fully privatized. Yeah, I'd put that at 1 in 3,000, something like that. That there'll be a country where they have greatly expanded the role of private police, private courts. That seems a lot more plausible. Give that 10% that there's a country where they just, like some country on Earth where government just plays very little role in the legal system anymore, and it's just very heavily taken over. I could see like a small country like El Salvador, they go full crypto. It's a place where we want to become like the great expat country. This is where people go and telework in peace, and we just have some very low tax rate on an enormous tax base of all the people that are based here. Right, so I could see something like that happening for like a country. But year 3000, wow, that's so far in the future. And my colleague Robin Hanson has said, well, what about 1 million years from now? And I'm like, you got me there, man. And like, even to think about what the world will be like in 1 million years, because I'm saying, look, human beings don't want to be replaced by robots. Like they won't, how about in 1 million years? Like, right. Maybe. Totally replaced us.
All right. Well, Bryan, this has been just a blast. Is there any other work that you want to highlight or anywhere that you want people to be able to find you before we wrap up?
Right. So all my stuff's on Amazon. You can get this latest book, Voters and Mad Scientists, for $12. You can get the other books of essays for $12. Then you've got all of my other books are also on Amazon. The single funnest read is definitely Open Borders. You can get through it in 2 or 3 hours. Also, it's one where the whole family can enjoy it. Everyone from a starting reader to a econ professor, I think, will find it a great read. Of course, that's just the author, but like my other books, I'm not going to say 5-year-olds will like them. So there's that. In terms of other stuff, let's see. So like I'm right now working on 2 new books. I have another nonfiction graphic novel, this one in housing regulation. It will be the absolute most fascinating book ever written on housing regulation in human history.
I live in San Francisco, so I am very much
Yeah.
looking forward to this.
Right now, I don't want to oversell this too much. Like so, the other books, I love the authors, but they're just not that fun. I hate to say it. Well, like this book is going to be fun. Like this book, I really wanted to. I've really done everything I can to make it a page turner, and I hope I've succeeded. I think I have. I think people are going to like. I think people are going to really like it when it's out. Been delayed a few times. The artist is going slower than we were hoping, but it's going to be great when it's done. We got a hard release date now of April 2024. And then the other thing that I'm going to get back to work on once we get off this call is my new book, Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. And this is one where social desirability bias is the whole heart of the book. And the main thesis is that we underuse markets because markets do the good stuff that sounds bad. And we overuse government because government does the bad stuff that sounds good.
All right, Bryan, thank you.
All right. My pleasure. Great meeting you.